we're in this together, and
Yeah.
we've got this great idea,
Yeah.
and we're going to
Yeah.
sell it to the world, and everything's going great, and it can all come apart.
That friendship starts to become, unfortunately, unravel. Your advice is to be careful and to have a shareholder agreement.
The other shareholder, you're not putting in the effort that you're supposed to be putting in.
But company law, corporate law, commercial, there's so much nuances and in that space. What are the different types of lawyers, at least in Australia, year 10, 11, 12, they think they want to become a lawyer, whether it would suit them or not?
I think the question would be, are you prepared to work really hard?
What are the 3 things you would say you should consider as a young entrepreneur? So, Daniel, welcome to the show. Tell me, what's your title? Because a lot of people, and partly why I wanted to talk to you, starting with myself, there's a lot of, it seems how the law firms are structured and run slightly different from a typical company. You hear so many different words that we go, oh, what does that mean? A partner and a partner manager or whatever. So what's your title in the law firm that you're at?
Yeah, my title is partner, and so we have a managing partner, and the rest of the owners' business are called partners.
Okay.
We're in a traditional partnership model.
Is it? So a partner is like a shareholder in a company, same thing?
Well, they're legally they're different things,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, practically we've got a small company with a small number of shareholders who are all involved in operating the business.
Yep.
It's reasonably similar from that perspective.
Yeah, see what I mean? Reasonably similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is slightly different, isn't it?
There is a difference.
Yeah.
But so we are a typical partnership.
Okay.
We all are owners of the business, so we're all involved in the decision making.
And a managing partner is like a CEO of a firm?
Effectively, yes,
Yeah?
that's right. So,
Or more of an operation manager, maybe?
I'd say a blend of both.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Our managing partner takes care of the day-to-day administrative decisions, so the rest of the partners don't have to worry about those things, but the managing partner is also involved in running his own legal practice.
It's so interesting, and this is going to be one of our topic today, to unpack a little bit, so-called corporate law or commercial law, company law versus, let's say, what's one thing that everybody probably knows about because of the crime shows that everybody's been watching since they were kids, the criminal law. I think people are fairly familiar with what that means.
Yes.
Right? But company law, corporate law, commercial, property kind of people that specialize in properties and, lawyers that specialize in properties and all that. There's so much nuances and in that space. I would love for you to be able to unpack for us. What's the difference? What are the different types of lawyers, at least in Australia, that aren't, let's say, criminal? If we leave the criminal law, what are the different types that aren't criminal laws for lawyers? What's these other types?
Sure. So there's a lot of different types of lawyers that operate in the area called civil law.
Civil, right?
Civil law. It's not criminal law. It's civil law. So
makes sense.
Within that area, you have a wide variety of lawyers, such as corporate/commercial lawyers who focus on advising businesses about a wide variety of issues, problems that can arise in a context, specifically within the corporate structure, typical private company or listed companies. So there are lawyers who make a living advising about mergers and acquisitions, acquisition of shares in companies, buying and selling. So it's really broad spectrum of advice that those lawyers give in that area, all the way through to litigation and dispute resolution, which is what I primarily specialize in. So taking other companies or people to court, defending people from being sued, advising clients when they get into trouble, think they're going to get into trouble in a commercial or shareholder context. There's a very wide variety of issues that pop up there.
Help me with something else as well here. Help me with something here, Daniel. Even in the criminal law, the understanding is you have a lawyer and you have the barrister. Is that right?
Yes.
The barrister is the one that... Is it similar in the corporate law? Can you speak to that, what the difference is between the two, even in the criminal law? We start with that maybe just to simplify it. And is it a mirror image sort of in the corporate law world? Or because I know that you're involved, you go to court. So if you don't mind, unpack that for us.
Yeah, sure. So whether it's criminal law or civil law, we have in Australia a split profession. So there are barristers who are sole practitioners. They operate by themselves and they specialise in court work and advocacy. So and providing...
What's advocacy? What do you mean?
Basically standing up and representing a client in court.
Oh,
so
okay.
being the client's advocate or voice in court.
Okay.
So solicitors can provide that service as well. Solicitors can also appear as advocates in court, but generally barristers specialise in that area of work.
Okay.
And so whether you're having a civil dispute, so you might be having a, let's for argument's sake, a dispute between shareholders. Generally, the solicitors will brief a barrister or might be two barristers, a senior and junior counsel, to provide specialist advice around making sure that the clients are doing all they can to have their case ready to go for a court.
Okay. It's interesting. We're getting closer to having some kind of picture here. So let's go back to the original question.
Yep.
We're talking about the criminal and the civil.
Yep.
And you said when it comes to civil law, you've got the so-called corporate law / commercial. Is that correct?
Yep.
Right. I heard there's a company law as well. Is there any difference or not really? Just all under corporate law, yeah?
It's generally the same thing. So company law might have a bit of a, amongst lawyers might have a bit of a narrower meaning. So referring to the law that applies around regulation of companies under the Corporations Act. Corporate law might have a bit more of a broader meaning with, talking about that, just broader advice work, advising companies generally. But they're more or less the same thing.
So for company law, you see a lot of these sort of small businesses that probably they are by far the largest number of companies around, if you want to sort of call them companies, right? They're still companies in a sense, right?
Yes.
I mean, the corner store and the fish and chips shop and stuff like that, they're all companies, businesses.
Yeah.
Not necessarily company, right?
Not necessarily.
What's the difference between a business and a company?
So a business is basically an undertaking, a business that someone runs for profit. A company is a structure. So you can be a sole trader and run a business. You can be a partnership and run a business, or you can be a company and run a business.
Got it.
And the structure that you use has, primarily has implications around, tax consequences and liability. And a company is a very popular structure which people use to run a business because it, for the most part, limits the liability of first of all, the shareholders, and secondly, the directors who are in charge of the company, because in law, a company is its own legal person. So it's a very popular structure for people to use because it limits their exposure to personal liability if something goes wrong with the company. Usually any liabilities are cheated home to the company, not the directors, as in the individuals who control the company. But there are some pretty important exceptions to that.
So can you be a company without being a business?
You can set up a company that doesn't trade. Its purpose might be simply to hold assets.
Got it. If you're going to be trading, having customers and collect money and send invoices, whatever, you have to have a business first, but then depending on the structure, whether you end up being a company or not. Is that correct? You always start with a business, or what am I missing? Which one comes first?
You start with the structure first. So you would, if you were starting a new business, you would work out what structure works best for you. For example, company versus partnership. And if you decide to go with a company, you would incorporate the company, and then the company would start trading the business.
So the law firms are on the model of the partnership. Is that what when I was asking you before, accounting firms, you hear that as well. You hear the word, but that's what the model is versus being a company. Yeah.
Well, often law firms use a partnership model, but there are law firms that use a company structure.
Okay, you don't have to, but
as well. You don't have to be a partnership.
But when you hear that kind of partners and stuff like that in a law firm, typically it would be the structure of that business, if you like, is based on a partnership model versus a company model.
Yes.
Am I correct there?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's we're getting there. We're getting there. No, seriously, you've unpacked it for me. Thank you. That's really good, man. Okay, let's talk about Daniel. When did you know you want to be a lawyer? Did you ever know you want to be a lawyer when you were growing up, or did that happen just by accident at some stage?
Look, that's a good question, and I'll have to reach back into the mists of time to remember when I first knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I think it was in high school, later high school years.
Why? How did that come about? I mean, as a young person in Australia, a lawyer, I'm not saying it's unheard of, but why not a sports person or something maybe more cooler or something? How did that lawyer happen?
Well, first of all, I was pretty terrible at sports, so I had to rule that one out fairly quickly. Couldn't be a professional sports person, but I think I wanted to do it because there was a desire to help people with their problems, and at heart, lawyers are problem solvers for their 100%. Clients.
Yeah.
So there was that part of it, and wanting to be part of the system of justice in the country.
Yes.
So kind of started with noble ideals.
Yeah. Actually, I'll take what I said back. Young people, a lot of young people are driven. They have that beautiful, innocent sense of social justice. They want to be part of that. They want to improve on that. They feel sorry for certain minority group. They feel they want to protect minority groups, etc. Want to create more, democracy and social justice in their societies. So I'll probably take what I said that back. That is pretty cool amongst a lot of young people. Even these days, more and more I hear of that.
Yeah, so, I think it's a big motivating factor.
Yeah, so is that how it started? It's more of a social justice than being corporate law, whatever. You probably didn't worry too much about that. More about social justice, do you feel? Or do you maybe unpack that a little?
I think that's right. I mean, look, different people are motivated by different things. And I'm sure there are people who join the legal profession because they do want to be part of that high-flying corporate world image that you see on TV, and that's fine. That everyone's got their own motivations, and look, a lot of people may join the profession because they're motivated by making changes or helping people and social justice issues, and they may find that the reality is a bit different when you get into practice, and the law is a very complex beast. But look, there's, essentially I'm a commercial lawyer, and I do work for commercial clients primarily. I do some pro bono work, but there's a lot of lawyers out there who are doing great work. For example, working for Legal Aid and the Aboriginal Legal Service, and those lawyers, really putting their ideals into practice, and not a lot of people can really say that they do that in such a genuine way. So yeah, I take my hat off to those practitioners.
I think you put it there nicely, man. You've summarised it. I agree with you. As a a high school student, say between year 10 and year 12, you're probably now seeing movies and TV shows, and on the news as well. You're probably seeing two categories. You've got this defense lawyer, and maybe someone that's really working hard and working for free for social justice, and you might be inspired by that, helping people, helping innocent people, etc. Or you might see this this expensive lawyer that's wearing very expensive suit, defending some billionaire and winning, and going celebrating, drinking expensive champagne on a $1 billion yacht or something like that. And they go, maybe I want to be part of that lifestyle as well. You're right. I guess that's sort of the two streams in a sense at high level, right? That's the corporate, the company lawyer, and that's the someone working with people and to on justice issues. And
yeah, I think that might be oversimplifying it a little bit. I mean,
even for a year 10 person, 16-year-old.
I think young people are quite astute, and I'm sure they realise that the portrayal of lawyers that you see on TV shows is not really what happens in the real world.
That's fair, yeah.
And I think whatever motivates a young person to join the profession, that's you've got to enjoy what you do. So as a career, I think that's really important.
You don't know what that entails, though. You're inspired by stuff you see. How does it work? I've never really talked to anyone about that or read about it personally, and I don't think it's fair to turn this conversation about that. None of us is a psychologist or something here. How do you, as a young person, you get inspired by someone you saw on TV or read in a book or you met on the news, etc.? How do you go, I want to be that person? How does that personality or that character resonates with you as a young person and with your aspirations and with your belief system and views of the world? How does that resonate with all that? It's interesting, isn't it? I'm not necessarily saying the answer to that.
I do not know the answer to that.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just clicks or not, right?
Yeah, that's right. And look, also, some people might be motivated by the challenge of being a lawyer, working in, I think whatever area of law you do, it can generally be a fairly high pressure environment, and some people seek that out because that's what makes them thrive. So
yeah, I agree. Okay, so you decided you want to be a lawyer, and how did you go about that? Like, did you then realize, oops, I've got to get certain grades to be able to qualify to go to a university, and you started to work towards that for sort of a year or two at least? Take us through that.
Yeah, well, I worked as hard as I could for my HSC to get the result that I wanted to get into university and study law. And
what was at the time? Give us an idea, roughly 98%, 95%, just roughly. What was that?
Yeah, so for the university that I went to, Macquarie University, it was a TER back then of 90.
90. Pretty solid.
Yeah. So just had to work hard and try and get the result that I wanted, and I did. So.
And you did, and you went to Macquarie University.
Yes.
For those of you that don't know where Macquarie is, it's probably 20 minutes drive northwest of Sydney, Macquarie.
Yes, about that.
Northwest,
yeah. That's right.
20 minutes from here. Okay, great. And 3-year degree, 4-year, how does it work? What's your journey like until you've become, let's say, what people call a lawyer? Explain to people the process.
Yeah, sure. So it was a 5-year degree. So combined with another undergraduate degree, I majored in with a Bachelor of Arts as my other degree. So you can.
Why did you do that?
I did a Bachelor of Arts majoring in modern history because I really enjoyed history in high school and wanted to do something.
It's amazing.
That I really found interesting.
What kind of history were you interested in? Ancient history, recent history?
Modern history.
Modern history.
Modern history. So
interesting.
Mainly studying the
Queen Elizabeth and
the French and Russian revolutions.
Yeah.
So you have to. I think it's different, slightly different now, but at least back then you had to combine your law degree with something else. So
you had to. You chose something you love.
That's right.
Okay.
So I could have done a Bachelor of Commerce, for example, majoring in accounting, but I'm hopeless with numbers, and so I'm definitely on
you love. That's
the
what matters.
side. Yeah. And
so Daniel, is it still the same now? Does it have to be a minimum 5-year degree now, or?
I think you can still do that law. Doing what's called a Bachelor of Laws, but now there's a new program called a Juris Doctor, but that's a post-grad degree, as I understand it. So you'd have to do a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Commerce first, and then start your Juris Doctor.
Okay.
Whereas back when I studied at university, it was usually just a combined degree. You do law and something else at the same time.
Okay.
And usually, if you're doing it full time, you would finish your your other undergrad degree in the first 3 years while you're still studying law, and then the last 2 years is just law.
Okay, so minimum of 5 years.
Yeah,
that's solid.
Yep.
Wow, good on you. Okay, so you did that, and then what happens next?
So usually after you finish your degree, if you're going straight into practice, then you have to do what's called the College of Law, which is basically a practical component, theory component, and a work experience component in order to be able to practice as a solicitor in New South Wales.
Okay. So, sorry, summarize that for me again in terms of what you did. So you finished that 5-year degree and then did what?
Well, I took a roundabout way to becoming a lawyer. So after I finished my degree, I joined the army, not as a lawyer.
Okay, yeah. And for how many years you were?
6 years.
6 years?
Yeah.
And then came back?
Correct.
Okay, and what did you do then?
So towards the end of my time in the army, I did the College of Law, which is that additional component I told you about that you have to do after your degree.
And that's how many? So repeat that for me one more time. Yep. How many months or years of full time?
Look, I think it was only a couple of months.
Okay.
Full time.
Okay.
But you've also got to do a certain number of hours in a law firm. So I called up I did work at a law firm while I was at university for a brief period as a registration clerk.
Yep.
Just running around filing documents in court and doing property settlements. I called that firm up and said, "Are you looking for a lawyer?" And managed to get a job there. So I did my practical legal training there and started as a lawyer there.
Okay.
After I was admitted to practice.
Do you remember the first sort of project that you got, so to speak, or case or however, once you become a lawyer at that firm? What was it?
Look, I worked on a variety of things, and as a baby lawyer, you just take whatever work anyone gives you.
I'm sure. Yeah. Anything interesting in the first year that you can remember to share? Nothing that I can really talk about without breaching confidentiality. So you don't have to talk about the details and who, just the type of case. So, for example, someone stole from someone or whatever. Like, you don't have to tell us who.
Look, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that's particularly spicy. Definitely no theft or anyone stealing from anyone. More boring. That's right. Yeah. Okay. I learned something interesting yesterday. I would love to get your opinion. You probably know so much about. I was watching this documentary. I have no idea how I ended up watching it, about the East India Company. Yes.
That started in this. Is it the 1700? or maybe the 1500? Do you remember?
It would have been around about the 1700s or maybe late 1600s, I think.
So just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, it started in Amsterdam. In what's this the main city in Amsterdam?
No,
the interesting city where all the drugs and all that happen.
I think that is Amsterdam. Is
that a city, not a country? Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, in Amsterdam. You're right. In Holland, Amsterdam.
Yes.
Yeah, it started in. I'm talking about the Amsterdam version, not the UK.
I
believe.
You're talking about the Dutch East India.
Thank you, Dutch East India Company.
Yes.
Thank you. That's the one. So that's 1700 as well.
Around about the same.
Cool. So here's what I've learned. They started the concept of company shares.
Yes, that's right.
You're aware of that? Did
Yes.
you study that? Did you know about that? I found that fascinating. And they were trading shares on the bridge. Do you know how it all started? They would go to, there's a bridge, whatever the name of the bridge, as you're coming into the city. They would go, whenever the weather would allow them to, stand over there and have a striking agreement about the share price.
Yep.
When they were exchanging that. I want to sell my shares. So basically they invented the concept of, so there was markets before, as in stock market, but they only exchanged goods. Company shares only got exchanged the first time was the Dutch East India Company, and it started. They invented the concept, and it got, and then they built a stock exchange in Amsterdam, and it became sort of formal there, and then spread around the world. So they started that in the Western world and in the world, trading the shares of a company.
Yeah, because they need to raise the money for these overseas ventures to bring back the spice. And
they could not pay people. They said to people, you've got to wait for 10 years. So people that couldn't wait within a year or two, they needed the cash. They started to have to transfer those shares, sell them and stuff.
Yes.
Because they couldn't say you will pay you within 12 months and stuff. They said, if you buy shares, you can't, expect your money back or whatever for 10 years. And that's what forced the idea of, okay, maybe I want to sell my shares now.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the whole concept of company shares. So we just discovered when it started in 1700. When did it become this crazy thing that is now? What's the evolution of that? And how does the world now, people like yourself who's worked with so many companies and seen the pros and cons of our current sort of state of, if you like, capitalism and the system that we're in, that we've been refining, in the Western world, in Australia, for example. I mean, does the world still believe in that system? Is that the only system, or is there some alternatives that's been proposed? Because clearly I don't read enough about the topic. Has there been any alternatives proposed, or is that the only system, the whole concept of company shares? What's the history of it? Where's the state of it now?
Well, I mean, it's just one part of the commercial world that serves a particular purpose, I guess. I mean, it's a fairly fundamental part of Western commercial society, if you like.
Yep.
So I don't know of any kind of alternative that's been proposed to the company structure, but I mean that there are different structures you can use, as we discussed, to operate a business. But that's a pretty broad-ranging question. It's a really useful structure. So it's definitely here to stay.
Yeah.
And it's might be probably the most widely used commercial structure.
So someone invents something of value, and they want money to get some of their investment back, but also to grow the company, either or both.
Mm-hmm.
And they invite, therefore, people that believe in the model to put money in, and the idea is to expand that pie. And the value of the company is going to grow because they sell that vision to people. So on that basis, if you're looking at young people who are thinking of starting companies, like when I was, I wasn't young, but a young entrepreneur in a sense, first time for me. So, but it could be young, it could be not, it doesn't matter. Someone who is new, who's just invented something now, about to invent something. They have something valuable and they don't know where to go with this. And they hear about startups and raising money and all that. It became cool in the last 20 years, right?
Yep.
What are maybe the 3 things, if we're going to talk about, for those young entrepreneurs to be wary of? What are the 3 things you would say you should consider, these 3 things as a young entrepreneur?
Sure. And look, that's actually a really great question, because I think a lot of people, be they young or not, that go into business make some fairly fundamental mistakes, and that can have consequences down the road.
Sure.
So, and bearing in mind, when people go into business with each other, it might all be, really friendly, and we're in this together, and we've got this great idea, and we're going to sell it to the world, and everything's going great, and
innocent and raw, and and good, and
that's right,
good
and
faith, and all that. Yeah,
exactly, and it can all come apart at some point down the track. So I think the 3 key things to think about are, so if you're going to start a company with other people as shareholders, directors, etc., then you should really have a shareholders agreement. And what that is, it's a document that tells everyone how this company is going to operate. What are we going to need to make unanimous decisions on? So, really important decisions. Do they need to be made with the unanimous agreement of all the shareholders, or can it just be by super majority or a simple majority? What happens if someone wants to sell their shares? Do they have to offer it to the other shareholders first? All these little details that people might not think about when they're just getting into business and starting things up, because they're not relevant at that point.
These friends who are entering into this adventure or venture in good faith, give us an example when things start to go bad and the friendships start to be deteriorate. What's an example that you've come across, a typical example where that friendship starts to become, unfortunately, unravel, and therefore why your advice is to be careful and to have a shareholder agreement? What's a typical example where things start to become difficult and it can really kill the friendship and kill the venture with it?
Sure.
Everybody ends up losing.
So you might have a situation where one shareholder thinks that the other shareholder is not putting enough effort into the business.
100% agree. That's the number one, isn't it?
Yep. And if there's no document saying what each shareholder has to contribute, then it's really hard for the shareholder who is working hard to say, you're not, to the other shareholder, you're not putting in the effort that you're supposed to be putting in.
Interesting. See, I didn't have that problem because it was my own idea, no one else. I didn't have co-founders, in other words.
Yep.
When I raised money, none of the shareholders, first of all, I didn't want any shareholders to work in the company. I wanted to be the CEO. I wanted it to be just shareholders, not and directors, not working in the business. So I didn't suffer from that too much, maybe. So I was lucky in many ways. Of course, I still had my own challenges. This is just we're scratching the surface here about the issues that you need to be aware of and make sure it's all detailed and you're aware of. But certainly, it's interesting what you said. But I guess I was very lucky. I didn't have to worry about that part, right?
Yes.
But yeah, when a few friends coming together and form an idea together, oh my God, that is 100% the number one.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really pays to have a shareholders agreement. So if something does happen, everyone knows what the procedure is. That still doesn't mean that it's no guarantee against disputes.
How can the shareholder agreement stipulate to that level of who's supposed to put how much hours, or I mean, how can it get to that level in terms of performance? For example, no matter what it says, people can still get into a fight by saying you're failing at what you do, you're not doing your part, this is why we're losing. No, you're the one who's not doing your part, this is why we're losing. Nothing can really stop that. That's probably the most difficult one when friends come in together to form a venture, isn't it?
Well, that's right, but it's also a matter of finding who's going to play what role in the company.
You can put that in the shareholder agreement?
Well, yeah, just to use your example, you came in as when you started up, you knew you wanted to be the CEO, and that's how it ran. So if you've got a situation where you've got a few people who get together, they know one person's going to be the CEO, that person should be employed by the company and have an employment agreement. And that way performance can be measured in the usual way that it's measured for employees. So you do get situations where the shareholders come in and they, one of them basically assumes a role of managing director. So you might have 3 shareholders, they're all directors, but one naturally takes the lead and the other 2 acquiesce.
What's the difference between a CEO and managing director?
So the CEO is usually an employee of the company. So managing director is someone who's on the board and
has to be a director first.
Has to be a director. CEO doesn't necessarily have to be a director.
That makes sense.
So, but you can have someone who is a director but is also employed by the company as a CEO.
Correct.
So it's really important to define those roles at the outset. Have agreements in place that mark out everyone's responsibilities.
You open my eyes about something when it comes to friends doing this together. Also, the fame aspect of it. When one person starts to attract all the attention and they became famous, for example, if one was dedicated as the CEO and they start to go all the interviews and the news and whatever, and they become really famous, and maybe the other friend is not getting as much attention, that could cause some issues as well. Have you come across anything like that?
I haven't come across anything really like that, but it's more the shareholder disputes that I've done, and I've done quite a few. That whole idea around someone, certain shareholders getting the impression that one of the shareholders isn't doing as much as they should for the business is quite a common one.
Yeah. And Daniel, does it always happen when things are going bad, or did you ever come across a dispute like that when things are going well? Let's say that company is growing by 30% year on year. I'm not going to even say 300%, but let's say 30-50%. As a startup, that is not unusual when you're still tiny. 50% is nothing, right? So when things are going really well, right, do you ever get disputes in that situation, or majority of the time would you say when things are going badly?
Look, I'd say the majority is probably when things are going badly, but you get shareholder disputes crop up in various situations where companies are performing well or not performing well, and various things can spark it off. It might be a shareholder who thinks that the company, even though it's doing well, it's going in the wrong direction. And so they want to get out and start their own business because they think they can do better. And you might have, restraint of trade issues there, which is another good reason to have a shareholders agreement in place. Because
So to go back to the advice to a first-time entrepreneur, we're going to call it, because it might be 18-year-old or 16 for this matter, or 14, or it might be 50 or 80. A first-time entrepreneur, the first advice is, especially a bunch of people doing it together, friends. First advice, to get a shareholder agreement. What's the second advice? We want 3.
Okay. So the second piece of advice is to get tax advice about the best way to structure, well, first of all, to what structure you want to use, and structuring the affairs of the company or the partnership, whatever model you're using, in the best way to achieve a good tax outcome. And that's advice I don't provide, but obviously they're specialist lawyers and accountants. People mostly rely on their accountants.
You're saying a bunch of people have an idea and they want to form a company or a business. You're saying before you commit to a model of a company and directors and shareholders versus partnership model, get a tax advice if you have the choice of either, because one of them could be a lot more lucrative for you.
Yeah,
in terms of return shareholder.
Well, there's different tax consequences for how where you structure an entity. They're taxed usually they're taxed differently. So a company is taxed differently to a partnership.
Example, because I have no idea about that. I know what a company tax is, but I have no idea how that partnership would be done. Do you have an example, like what kind of figures, numbers, how does it work?
I can't give you a good example because I don't specialize in that area. That's why I always tell my clients just to get specialist advice. Obviously, you've got to weigh up against any tax advice, you've got to weigh up the benefits of using a company for all those reasons I talked about earlier in terms of limiting personal liability. So that will generally be the way to go for new people who are starting out a new business. Generally, a company is the best way to go, just to limit your personal liability.
Sure.
But it's always good to speak to your accountant before you kick the venture off, because
it could become harder to change later.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's why you're saying from the very beginning get that.
That's right.
So number one, get a shareholder agreement.
Yes.
Number two, get an advice from a tax.
Let's say you're just your accountant.
An accountant.
Yep.
Sure. About the structure of the business.
That's
right.
For
example, whether it's a company or a partnership model.
And even if you're going to use a company, your accountant might tell you, well, you should hold your shares in a family trust.
Got it.
So you can, any income you get, through the company, you can use the trust to stream that tax effectively.
Got it. That's awesome. What's the third advice to do you remember we're doing 3 advisors for a first-time entrepreneur?
Yep.
What's the third advice?
The third piece of advice is to look at the structure you're using to maximize asset protection. So, for example, if you've got some very valuable IP, you would probably establish one company to hold the IP and then establish a separate company that trades the business.
Okay.
You would have a license between the IP holding company and the company that operates the business.
And what's the advantages of that?
So the company which operates a business is going to be at most risk, particularly when starting out, because you might be incurring a lot of debt to get the business off the ground. So if your IP is sitting in the trading company and the trading company becomes insolvent, then that IP is gone. Whereas if you've got it in a separate company, you've got a much better chance of holding on to it because it's in a separate legal entity. And generally.
But it's going to be if everybody's come together from the very first time and they agree to that, it's fine. But when you go to raise capital, that's going to be very questionable. People not going to like it to invest into the trading business. They want to know that they invest in the IP, right? So that dynamic at some point might not be always viable, and will have to be looked into, and how you can maybe bring both of them into an overarching company for those shareholders to know that they're, owning shares in the IP, right?
That's right. And that's another good reason to speak to your accountant when setting the business up, because they will have good ideas about how to structure it from a financially sound perspective.
Good point. So why should a young person become a lawyer?
Good question. Look,
it is a good question.
Look, it depends on their personal motivation, but it is a noble profession. lawyers are intimately involved in the administration of justice, and it's it's got its challenges, but it's also very rewarding to be able to help people with a problem and solve that problem for them. So
you see yourself, Daniel, as a problem solver. You mentioned it before. I never thought of a lawyer as a problem solver, but you're absolutely right. What am I thinking? 100% problem solver. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about trying to guide the client, navigate the client to the best outcome in the circumstances, whatever those circumstances may be. And the client might have put themselves into some pretty bad circumstances. So, a good outcome is going to depend on what the issue is when the client comes to you and tells you, the difficulties that they're facing.
What's the one thing you want a young person that thinks they want to, let's say someone in high school, year 10, 11, 12, they think they want to become a lawyer. What's the one thing you want to say to them? Are you sure in the sense of whether it would suit them or not? What's the one question now in hindsight that you would go, they should be asking themselves as a test, whether it's going to suit them or not? Is it maybe the lifestyle, what kind of money you're thinking of earning, or the kind of personality, the kind of hours, do you really you're someone that want to play sports and be home at 4 or 5 and spending time with the family, having a beer with the neighbors, versus someone that want to work long hours? What's the one question you want to say? You need to answer that question before you make that decision to make sure you're not going to be, surprised in a sense, in a negative way, like end up doing something not going to work for you.
I think the question would be, are you prepared to work really hard? Because being in the profession does involve a lot of hard work, a lot of long hours.
Where does that come from? What's mostly those long hours, that hard work is? Research? Is it what? Share with us, say on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, the bulk of the work, the type of work. What are the main 3 types of works that you do that take up, say, 75% of all your time?
Well, it depends on where you work and what type of area you're practicing.
Where
I think,
you're at in your career as well.
Yeah, that's right. So, the most of the biggest component of work that takes up a junior lawyer's time will be quite different to.
Let's talk about junior lawyers. Good start.
Yeah. So junior lawyers are usually involved in doing a fair bit of research work, although that is probably changing to a fair degree with the advent of AI. So
that's saving now a lot of that time, the research share, to acquire the information.
That's right. Yeah. But I mean, it shouldn't really replace junior lawyers, but hopefully just be a tool that allows junior lawyers to be more efficient in their research. But certainly, you would expect a junior lawyer to be doing a fair bit of research, but also hopefully doing drafting.
Give these folks, these young guys, an example of research. What are we researching? Give us an example, something that crosses your mind in last month that one of your junior lawyers did and really was important for you, helped you with something, and what that research was, the nature of the research.
Sure. So it usually involves finding out the answer to particularly might be a point of law that you don't come across very often, or something that's quite difficult, and you want to make sure that you get the answer right. So you want to delve into the case law and make sure that you're giving the client the right advice.
Yep. For example, the latest legislations about employment law from our federal government, maybe things about unpaid leave and paid leave or whatever. You want to make sure there hasn't been any updates since the last information. What's the latest thing about that?
Yeah, that's right. Or it might be new law that is coming into effect, and you want to know the ins and outs of that. For example, the introduction of the new residential tenancy laws, which are going to prohibit landlords terminating a residential lease without cause. So, something you need as a lawyer, you need to be across, it's going to come into effect soon.
I didn't even know there was some protection laws like that. That's really cool. So someone cannot just evict you without any reason. For example, if they want to move in the apartment, maybe is that one a good, what's a good reason and what's a bad reason?
Well, obviously, if the tenant's not paying rent, that will still be a reason to terminate. But there's already mechanisms around making sure you give the tenant notice that they're in arrears and things like that. But there are going to be increased protections for residential tenants, and that's something that certain lawyers will need to be across as part of their practice. So they might tell a junior lawyer, look, can you read the bill and let me know what's in it and what we need to be aware of.
What do you think about company laws and company taxes in Australia, for example, versus the US? What are the things that you, over the years, you go, maybe something in the US they do better than what we do, in your opinion, as a person, as an Australian person, but also as a professional, as a senior lawyer? Australia versus the US, company laws, corporate laws. What are a couple of things that maybe you think we do better here versus something in the US they do better?
Well, look, I don't know enough about US company law to give you a really good answer, except to say that I think the one benefit that we have in Australia is that our Corporations Act is a federal law, so it applies throughout Australia, as opposed from state to state. Whereas, in the US, I'm fairly certain that they have different laws to apply depending on what state you're in.
Hence, for example, the whole thing of California, a lot of companies left and came to Texas and claiming that the corporate, environment is not as conducive for them, not as positive, and because it's a state-based,
that might be one reason. It might also be because they might feel that California is not giving them enough business incentives to stay in that state. So that's a separate issue. That's a policy issue, not a legal issue.
Sure.
But
because that's still applicable here. Our states can provide
exactly.
Sure.
Incentives for businesses to operate in their state. But
so what you're talking about is, give us an example of what you mean then.
Oh well, corporate regulation and knowing what laws apply to.
For example,
companies.
employment law, like what we discussed before, that's all federal.
Employment law is also federal, but just kind of going back to the original topic of just company law. So in the US, there might be, companies might be able to do have more, liberty to operate in a particular state than in another state. So, in Australia, we have, regulation around various things that companies can and can't do, and same applies in the US, but I imagine it would differ from state to state. So if you, whether you start in Australia, whether you start up a company in Tasmania or Western Australia, the same laws will apply to how that company is allowed to operate. So you've got more certainty, I guess.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. And so we talked about a young person that want to join the legal industry. What sort of, we talked about why or what they need to be mindful of. You talked about the hard work, and an example of the hard work as a junior person, a lot of research for you to be up to date with legislations, with laws, with also, when I picked up a law book, about 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, it was all examples. I expected science. I come from a science background. I was a physicist and then computer scientist, and there was no science. It was all these examples.
Yep.
And now, for example, in the US, you see during the election cycle, they talk about, for example, the abortion legislations and stuff like that. The right for women to choose, stuff like that. They also cite examples. It's always about examples and precedents. Talk to me about that. Is that right? The way I see it, very different from science. It's all based on precedents and what happened 20 years ago. The outcome of a particular case 20 years ago or 100 years ago, whatever. Am I missing something here, or a lot of that is all like that? It's all precedents. And how do you describe it? Do you see it the way I see it, as someone stranger, not from the industry?
Yeah. So in Australia, we have a common law system, which means it's a legal system which is based on precedent. But we also have governments which can pass legislation which can change or modify the common law, which has been developed by judges over quite a long period of time. So yes, you will, if you pick up a law textbook, you will see a lot of examples.
Is that what you call them, examples, or am I using the wrong word?
No, well, there are.
How do you describe
there are generally in the law, there are principles, and they're illustrated by examples of cases.
Cases,
yep.
Example
So you will have cases which, basically, there might be a principle of law in the textbook, and it will, give you few cases and the facts and the outcomes of those cases which support the principle.
Yeah. Speaking of law and different types of laws, for example, what does it fall under, this whole tariff, for example? These are government strategies, clearly. They're not. So is that someone specializes in government law? What do you call that kind of law, where someone ends up being an advisor in Canberra to the government and state government or federal government? What kind of law would you say that is?
Well, if they're if they're working for the government and they're advising the government on implementation of policies and things like that, and they're a lawyer, they're practicing in public law.
Public law, so okay.
So which is this means the laws which apply to the government and implementation of
Has Australia played around with tariffs over the last, say, 100 years? Do we have examples of some tariff wars between us and some countries? And what's the consensus amongst Australian here, whether on the left or the right, in terms of how we perceive tariff? Is there some kind of consensus, or not really? We've never sort of experienced with that much.
Look, that's the first question, I think, is a history question, and not really...
Not that kind of history anyway.
Qualified to answer that. I didn't cover that in my studies on the...
Because a lot of companies, companies like us who are involved in the US as well, now selling into the US, and a lot of Australian companies clearly that are strong partners with companies in the US, are sort of bracing to what that tariff could mean to the world. And I know that Australia is not, at much of a risk of that. But nevertheless, the corporate world is now trying to sort of catch up on what that means. What's tariff and how does it work? And historically, has that been played before that game? And what's the outcome of that? For example, there's a lot of nuances to it, because it might affect in a certain way this direct industry, but there's a lot of subsidiary and indirect industries that actually produce all these little parts, let's say for the car manufacturer, that are affected by that downstream differently. There's a lot of nuances. It's a very interesting topic when you start to look into it. So I'm just wondering if you've ever given that a thought, or has Australia been in that situation before? And over the years, how do we perceive that as a good thing, a bad thing, or not something that we're really keen at going back to, in a sense?
Well, I think look, it's definitely an important policy and economic question, and obviously it's a hot button topic at the moment because of the likelihood that the US will impose tariffs on imports into the US.
Look,
countries do place taxes on imports. I'm not sure exactly what Australia's position is on it. It often can depend on the industry that's involved and the country, the trading partner that's involved.
I mean, how does it work? Like for Australia, we do it on a per country basis. It's not like one rule fits all, right? We can basically say with Germany, with the cars from Germany versus France, let's say we import from both, yeah? I don't know, BMWs and Mercedes from Germany, we import Renaults and couple of other brands from France as well. So in Australia, we have the right to negotiate that kind of tax, if you like, on luxury cars from each country without offending any other country, right? And I guess it sort of makes sense to do it on, you look at your total sort of deficit in a sense, how you're trading with that country, how much they're buying from you, how much you're buying from them, and then you can come up with a deal to acknowledge that and to make sure that makes sense and acknowledges, if they are a big customer of yours, the fact that you're going to therefore maybe lower your own taxes. I mean, it's really negotiable. I think it's sort of common sense. But is there anything that I'm missing where if you do that, then you might come across as you're discriminating? What's the consensus out there? And when we say free market, I mean, is it really free, or are you still negotiating really with every country what your tax is going to be when they bring in blah or blah, right?
Yeah, look, I'm not across, the whatever trade agreements Australia might have in place.
I know it's not your field. We're just talking as just both of us as Australians, and we have businesses in this country, and not more than that, really. I know it's not your field, yeah.
Yeah, but look, it's obviously a really important question.
Yeah,
but,
interesting.
I guess everyone's waiting with bated breath to see how it plays out next year.
Yeah. Very good. One thing I want to talk to you about as well, if we go back to the company law and the whole structure of a company, when a first-time entrepreneur is setting up a company, that difference between, they don't understand the difference between an employee, a manager, an exec, a shareholder, a director, those sort of layers. Can you unpack it for them? What are sort of those layers that they need to be aware of?
Yeah, sure.
And therefore, their understanding when they're trying to set up a company and a shareholder agreement, do they want to be the CEO, and therefore what's the awareness about all these different levels?
Yep. So starting at the I guess the fundamental level is the shareholders in the company. Mm-hmm. So they are the owners of the company in a sense. They own the shares in the company, and depending on the Constitution and shareholders agreement and the provisions of the Corporations Act, they have certain rights as shareholders. And then we look at the next level of the company. It's the directors of the company, and they control the day-to-day management of the company.
So just to be clear, even the CEO is an employee.
CEO.
Oh, sorry, you started with the shareholders. So I'm sorry.
Yep, that's all right.
Yeah, you got your shareholders, and then
the directors.
The directors. Sorry.
Yeah, and the directors are the management of the company. They control what the company does and make decisions about the day-to-day management of the company and its business.
Well, that's the management, though. What's the difference between the management team?
Well, that's a good point. So the directors can, delegate the day-to-day running of a company to an employee like CEO.
Delegating that power, it's really based on the employment contract, really. You're right. It is a delegation of the power. How much power this board decided to delegate to the CEO, right?
Yeah, that's
that
right.
Relationship.
That's right. So
interesting. I never saw it like that. That's the word, delegating.
Yeah. So you can have a board of directors that will perhaps meet once a month and the CEO will report to the board. They know what's going on, make sure that the company's running properly. That, it might be in a bigger company, but for a smaller company, like a startup, you might just have, for example, the example we used before, 3 shareholders who are also 3 directors, and you might have one director who's, the managing director, and he or she takes responsibility for the day-to-day running of the business.
I often get asked by employees, do I get in trouble if something goes wrong? If we're talking about something, a risky part of our business, and we try and make decisions, you get sometimes some employees scared about, can we do this? Do we get in trouble? Do I get in trouble? I often say to them, listen, you're not going to get in trouble. The directors get in trouble. Is that at high level correct, or am I oversimplifying it?
Look, I guess if it's something that the company is doing generally, and the company does the wrong thing, then generally the employees won't be in trouble for that if it's a decision that the directors have made. There's also legislation in New South Wales called the Employee Liabilities Act, which says that if an employee commits a tort or civil wrong like negligence.
Okay, let's use that word, negligence. Sure.
As part of their employment. So if they make a mistake, then the employer has to indemnify the employee against a claim for negligence that's made by...
What's the act called? By whom?
The Employee Liabilities Act.
And that's
New South Wales legislation.
Yep. Okay, so states-based.
That's correct.
Some other states might not have that, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And we have this principle in as part of the common law called vicarious liability, which means that an employer will be liable for the acts of the employee if they're committed in the course of the employee's employment. So if someone driving a truck for their employer accidentally crashes into someone's house, then the employer can be held liable for the act of the employee.
How about let's use that example, the truck thing. How about if they were, say, drunk driving?
Well, then
a clear cut drunk driving.
Yep, that's one of those tricky areas of law where the employer might argue, well, I didn't authorize. Yes, I authorized the person to drive the truck, but I, of course, didn't authorize them to drive it.
Absolutely, I expected them to stay legal and to be responsible adults.
Yes, so that might be a case where the employer is not liable.
Okay, interesting. So the company doing something negligence, which would be a decision by the board, instructions given by the board. But during the execution of those instructions, this is when it becomes murky. For example, in this case, as a board, we say we're going to hire truck drivers, and we're going to equip them with good, we're going to hire people who are qualified and have got driving licenses and etc. And we're going to give them good trucks, and the trucks are going to be maintained and all that.
Yep.
And then during the execution, this person could have an accident, really genuine accident, or really for example, they're doing driving stuff. So that during the execution of the instructions from the board, things can go wrong, and that's where that area can be a bit murky. Is it really company's fault, or should the company indemnify them? Or no, it's their fault, they did something illegal in the sense. Would you use that word in that context if they're drunk driving?
Oh, yeah, that is definitely illegal.
Cool.
Yes.
So,
that's one area of the law which is pretty clear.
Definitely illegal. And that means the company can argue we cannot possibly indemnify someone that decided on purpose to do something illegal while on the job.
Yeah, that's correct. Look, I'm not exactly sure how that would work as between employer and employee.
Yeah.
If so, that legislation I talked about, what that legislation means, that if someone sues the employee directly, the employer has to defend their employee from that claim. But usually in that kind of situation we're talking about, the person who's suffered the damage, so if the driver crashes the truck into a house, they will usually just sue the employer because they good bet that the employer will be covered by insurance.
Sure.
So there'll be money to meet the claim.
Sure.
And they might not worry about suing the employee.
So what do you do as an employer then? You're going to have to defend the case by saying it's not our fault. The employee did something illegal. Take it with the employee.
Yeah.
Is that what will actually
or
happen?
If you should have insurance, and hopefully your insurer will step in and
but why would you want to take that on your insurance and end up losing that potential that spend that you have with your insurance for the year, let's say, or if you don't feel that this is on you, you've done everything right, and that person decided on purpose to do something illegal, why would you want to indemnify them? You don't have to.
Well, yeah, you may not have to indemnify the employee, but if the employer is sued, they've got to defend the claim.
Sure.
And it's just a business decision looking at your the excess on your insurance policy and deciding whether it's worth paying the excess and just letting the insurer take over. Because if you are found liable, then hopefully your insurance will cover that.
Yeah. It's an interesting point you touch on. There's this perception that when you have an insurance as a business, as a company, clearly you hear that a lot. Everybody, when they talk about it, and they claim the way they speak about it with such confidence as if they know what they're talking about. But the perception is, if as a company you make a lot of claims, that means your premium is going to go high and blah, blah, blah. Just talk a little bit about that in terms of, is there any kind of legislations? Is there anything federal or whatever that protects a company not to be discriminated against, for example, by an insurance company when they, by complete random of events, they happen to use and make claims, but not intentional, complete randomness, yet they could be discriminated against? I mean, that could literally wipe out the company. And I don't feel this is fair. What do you know about that, Daniel? And is there any protection to those companies by the government or the state government?
Look, I don't specialise in the area of insurance.
Oh.
So, look, all I know is that, insurers, they cover risk and they have to price the risk. They, as we know, they look at, usually we'll look at previous claims history and decide whether that company has a higher risk profile, so they should a larger premium so that the insurer is protected for that increased risk profile. And that's really just a commercial decision that the insurer makes and is able to make. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know for certain, that there's no regulation around that.
Pure commercial decision whether they're going to take on your insurance or not.
Yep.
They might decline your offer to be insured by them.
Yes.
And you go to another organization and they're going to say no, and you might end up no one want to cover you if for some reason they felt that you're not taking those risks seriously enough and doing everything you can to minimize those risks. You're high risk sort of company.
Yep, that's right.
In a certain area, in a certain risk profile.
Yes.
That's something really important for companies then, and directors, yeah?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, it's really critical for companies and directors to have insurance in place for to cover as much risk, business risk as possible, because claims can be very expensive.
Yep.
So it's important to have the best protection you can have.
The last point that we're going to do today on this podcast, and going back to the first-time entrepreneur. Yep. In terms of what they can learn from, I'm going to use the word, the pop culture, if you like, of companies, in the last 20 years. Two examples, two of the largest or the most successful companies in recent histories, which is Apple and Uber.
Mm-hmm.
Both founders lost their job as a CEO. Two of the most successful ever companies in the history of companies.
Yep.
Okay. And they remain in the top 5. Okay. Can you, how can you unpack that? What happened and how legally this can happen, and where it's a lesson for a first time or, entrepreneurs in terms of why it's important for them to understand a shareholder agreement and a structure before they get into an agreement of raising capital, bringing shareholders on board and directors on board. That could be a lesson for them. Do you know much about any of them? Maybe you don't. I'm putting you on the spot here by any means. If you don't know, we did talk about something else, but is there anything at least that you can sort of know at high level that can be a learning lesson for people to start to look into?
Look, I don't know anything about those particular stories with the CEOs of Apple and Uber.
Yeah, Steve Jobs in the case of Apple.
Yeah.
So that's, gosh, now probably 25 years ago, 30 years ago. That would have been in the 90, I'm sorry, give me a sec. In not 94, around the 94.
Yep.
Yes, because 94 is when Steve Jobs was starting Pixar. So he would have lost his job out of Apple in about 92, 93, if I was to guess, something around that. But in the case of Uber, we're only talking 4 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah.
Look, I guess, making a business work, as you know, is just really hard work and takes a lot of effort, and got to constantly have your eye on the ball. And I think just having the knowledge around how the company structure works, what your responsibilities are as a director, and I think that's something that a lot of people when they're starting out don't pay much attention to, or just unaware of, that director has really serious obligations to the company. And there are, despite the benefits of limiting personal liability in using a company, there are still a lot of risks for directors. So, for example, company doesn't lodge and pay its tax on time, the directors can be personally liable for that. Directors can be personally liable for work health and safety breaches. So there are still avenues to make directors personally liable. So there's that aspect to it, and then there's that just getting that structure right, and for example, just when you talk about capital raising, are you going to raise capital by borrowing money or by issuing shares? So two different ways of doing it, different outcomes.
Raising shares is not for everyone. It comes at a cost. Not everyone can deal with working with a group of shareholders where they feel it's not my company anymore. It's our company. So what I'm saying is, can you give that kind of warning to those first-time entrepreneurs before you start to talk about raising capital? You need to be comfortable with the fact that it's not going to be your company anymore. And that's, I guess, Daniel, why I'm saying even Steve Jobs lost his job. The most creative person in the world, changed the world forever.
Yeah.
Right? And same with Uber. And they still lost their job. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are. It's another game when you bring shareholders and directors on board. And you become just one of many directors. It's not your company anymore.
Yeah. Well, but it might depend on how much capital you're putting in, and that might give you effective control of the company, and you will know your position is secure. But if you're growing and you're bringing in more investors,
Zuckerberg, amongst the top 20 companies in the last 20 years, tech companies, is the only guy that was able to raise capital on his terms. Stayed completely controlled the board and raised in excess of $10 billion. It's never been done before. Yeah,
it's a very difficult thing to do, right? So, if you're bringing in investors, they will want to know that their money's just not going to go to waste, and they might want to have a say in what happens with the management of the business.
I was just acknowledging your point, Daniel, but I just wanted to really explain different ways because, as you said, there's many ways of getting access to money. I guess if we call it access to money, right? Access to capital. It doesn't have to be always to raise capital and bring directors on board. It can be borrowing money. There's what other options that you can just explain it so as a one-time entrepreneur can start to research the different ways of accessing capital to make sure they don't end up in a situation thinking it's the only way to raise capital. And then all of a sudden, you know what? I'm still not prepared of accepting it's not my company anymore, and clash ought to happen and they end up in trouble and losing the whole thing.
Yeah. So look, a really common way is, to raise capital is to borrow money, because if you've got a couple of people together forming a company, if you borrow the money, it means you don't have to bring other shareholders in and get them to buy into the company. But no, you've got the issue for people in that situation, if they're borrowing money, is that the lender might expect some security, maybe in the form of a personal guarantee or mortgage over property. So each scenario presents its own things to think about and risk to manage.
Daniel, borrowing money for, let's say, a tech company whereby there's no assets, as opposed to investing in a farm or something like that.
Yep.
When you're borrowing money, is it usual or unusual for the lender?
Yeah, the person
providing the capital.
Yep.
To basically say, listen, we want to be able to have a clause where we can recall the full money that we gave you, all the debt, if, for example, the performance it goes down or something like that. Is that usual?
Oh, sure. Look, I mean, banks will often have in their loan documents, if it's a business loan, if they consider that there's been a material adverse effect on the business, that they can
recall the money,
call in the loan.
But people borrow money because they want to be able to insure themselves against those sort of downturns and stuff. How does that make sense for the people giving you the money to say we're going to be your partner only in the good times? How does that work?
Well, look, it's just a matter of commercial negotiation between the borrower and the lender.
Sure, so, but why would someone accept that? Desperate, I guess.
Yeah, desperation.
Especially when you don't own an asset.
That's right.
You only have an idea, nothing else.
That's right. And that's a big reason why some people don't like buying shares, for example, in a newly formed company, because no history of performance, there's no guarantee you'll get your
high risk for the investor.
Yep. Yeah. And unfortunately, I have had clients who've bought shares in a startup and they didn't quite realize the difference between buying shares and making a loan. Thought that because they'd put their money into the company, they could just ask for it back. And that's often not the case.
Yeah.
So
but that's why it's a high risk venture and high return. When you
potentially.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Well, exactly. High risk, high return.
Yeah.
When you say potentially, that's why it's called high risk. I mean, it's the same thing, right? You're right. Yeah. And as opposed to, as a lender, if you say, look, I lend you the money, then you're not going to get more than anything between 10 to 20%, as opposed to the potential 1,000% or whatever. Isn't it? That's the pros and cons.
Generally, that's right. Yeah.
But the two warnings I really want a first-time entrepreneur to learn from this is, if you're borrowing money from a bank or someone like that, look into the agreement.
Yes.
Be careful, because you could lose the whole thing. If there's a clause in there that says, based on certain performance degradation, we can recall the whole loan, you are gone.
Absolutely.
You are gone. The company's gone. You destroyed the whole thing. Be very, very careful.
Yes.
And the other warning, if they decide to go down the shareholder agreement, or in other words, shares, selling shares of their company, selling parts, therefore, of their company, to know, to realize it's not going to be your company anymore.
That's right. And look, you still might control a majority of the company. You might own a majority of the shares, but
Sure.
but once you bring in minority shareholders,
They have rights.
they have rights. If you're not, if you're treating the minority shareholders unfairly, then they could
you can get in trouble.
Yeah,
lose the whole thing.
They could make a claim that you're
Absolutely
engaging in oppressive conduct. You're oppressing the minority, and that can give rise to court proceedings. And
it's a big decision. Really think about it before you make any decision about how you're going to access capital.
Absolutely.
Based on your personality, based on your appetite for risk and for being in confrontational situations with other shareholders, having to go to courts, etc. Really where you are in life and what kind of person you are, and really be careful you understand all these different options. And see a lawyer. Oh my God, if there was one advice I would give people like this, is to see a lawyer. The best money you would ever invest.
Absolutely. It's a good idea to do it at the start, and it does cost money to get advice, and it costs money to have a shareholders agreement drawn up, but it might save you a lot of money down the track.
I was talking to someone I admire and love, a family member. Beautiful person, very smart. She lives in Doha in Qatar. She was telling me she's working for a company that's based in Dubai, and she's the business development person in Qatar for their business, and she want to be able to do some kind of deal with them to sort of franchise that business over there. It's for her to be able to invest money to expand it, advertise it, open physical stores or whatever to be able to expand the business there. And when I said to her, this is great, I'm really proud of you, but surely you're going to talk to a lawyer, right? She was completely surprised. She never even crossed her mind. She thought she was going to have a conversation with them and maybe a bunch of emails and start to put money, invest into expanding that business under total protection, total ownership of the IP by still that company. Yeah. She owns no IP, nothing. It's going to invest money to expand that business. She almost had a fight with her to just say to her, I'm not even telling you what to do. All I'm saying is see a lawyer. Yep. And make sure they are in Doha where you are, that understands your environment, Absolutely. Your country, your situation, and gives you an advice. Eventually she came around to the idea, but it was so incredible for me, a reminder of how innocent I was 20-something years ago, how I would have made the same decision and not even sought a lawyer. So really it is a big thing. The best money you could ever invest is to find a lawyer that you can trust, someone with integrity, to be able to have a conversation with them about what you're trying to do.
Absolutely.
And on that basis, you are awesome. Thank you for your time, mate. And we'll talk to you again, I'm sure.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Amber.
You're welcome, man. Cheers.